Richard Blackwell reached across the table and touched Claire's hand like he already owned her. He smiled while he did it. Slow, deliberate, the kind of smile that knows exactly what it's doing. His thumb traced a small circle on her knuckles. Claire went still. She didn't pull away fast enough, and across the ballroom, through 200 people in black tie and champagne, Vincent Callahan saw every second of it. He didn't move. That was the thing nobody in that room understood about Vincent. When something truly dangerous happened, he got quieter. His hand stopped midair above his whiskey glass. His jaw tightened once, then released. His eyes didn't leave Richard's hand on his wife's skin. The man beside Vincent kept talking about Port Authority contracts. Vincent didn't hear a single word. If you were Claire right now, married to a man who treated you like furniture for 18 months, suddenly facing the only person who ever actually looked at you, what would you do? This story is going to take you somewhere most love stories don't have the courage to go. If you've ever loved someone who didn't know how to love you back, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because what happens after this moment will change everything. The gala was called the Manhattan Heritage Foundation Benefit, which meant nothing except that it cost $10,000 a plate, and everyone there had something to hide behind their philanthropy. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom had been dressed in white and gold, and the chandeliers threw light across faces that had learned over decades of money and power how to look like they weren't calculating something. Claire Whitmore, Claire Callahan, now, technically, though she rarely thought of herself that way, had worn a midnight blue dress because she knew Vincent preferred her in dark colors for public events. She hadn't done it to please him. She'd done it because 18 months of living in the same house as a man who communicated through staff memos and security briefings had taught her to minimize friction wherever she could. She was 31 years old. She had a graduate degree in art history from Columbia that she'd never used. She had a husband who hadn't touched her since their wedding night. Even then, it had been nothing, just a hand at the small of her back as they turned for the photographer. And she had learned to fill her days with the Met, with museum board committees, with the careful performance of being Mrs. Vincent Callahan without ever actually being his wife. She was good at the performance. Everyone said so. Richard Blackwell had introduced himself between the appetizer course and the cocktail hour, which meant he'd timed it deliberately, when the crowd was shifting and Vincent was caught in conversation with the deputy mayor 15 feet away. He was 60, maybe 62, with silver hair and the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by someone who mattered to him. He knew who she was. Of course he did. Everyone at that level knew who she was. "Mrs. Callahan," he'd said, "I've heard so much about you from the foundation board. Your instinct for the Impressionist collection last spring was genuinely inspired. It was a real compliment. That was what threw her. Most men at these events complimented her dress or her husband's business acumen or the generosity of the Callahan family's charitable giving. Richard Blackwell had done his homework on what she actually cared about. They talked for 12 minutes. She knew because she checked her watch when he walked away. A reflex she'd developed to keep herself oriented at these events, where time moves strangely, and Vincent expected her within arm's reach at the end of every hour. During those 12 minutes, Richard Blackwell was funny and specific and asked real questions, and when she answered them, he actually listened, which was something she had stopped expecting from most people. He touched her hand once when he was making a point about a Monet acquisition that had been controversial. A brief contact, 2 seconds at most, nothing that would register as anything at a crowded gala. She didn't think about it again until Vincent appeared at her shoulder. He didn't say anything immediately. He handed her a fresh glass of water. She'd been holding an empty one for 10 minutes, and stood beside her looking out at the room the way he always did, like he was cataloging threats. His shoulder was 3 inches from hers. He smelled like cedar and something underneath it that she'd never been able to name. "Who was that?" he said. "Richard Blackwell. He's on the foundation board, I think. Or he's considering a major gift. I'm not sure which." That was all he said. Claire waited for more, and when it didn't come, she went back to watching the room, and they stood together in their customary silence, the kind that had calcified over 18 months into something neither of them bothered trying to break anymore. She told herself nothing had happened. She was wrong. What? The car ride home was 45 minutes because there was construction on the FDR. Vincent sat on his side of the town car's back seat and looked at his phone, scrolling through something she couldn't see. Claire sat on her side and looked out the rain-smeared window at the city sliding past, all red taillights and wet pavement reflecting yellow from the street lamps. She was almost drowsy by the time they pulled up to the building. The penthouse elevator required a key card and a 6-digit code that changed weekly, which she had always found either reassuring or suffocating depending on her mood. Tonight it felt like the second thing. The elevator opened directly into the foyer, and Marcus, the night security lead, built like a refrigerator and never without an earpiece, nodded once and stepped aside as they entered. Vincent said something quiet to Marcus in passing, and Marcus nodded again, and then it was just the two of them in the penthouse, which had 14 rooms and still somehow felt like not enough space. Claire set her clutch on the entry table. She was reaching up to unclasp her necklace when she realized Vincent hadn't moved toward his study the way he always did. He was standing in the middle of the living room watching her. She lowered her hands. "What? How long have you known Blackwell?" It wasn't phrased as a question exactly. His voice had a quality she'd heard maybe twice before, flat, but with something underneath it pressing upward, like ground before an earthquake. "I met him tonight," she said, "at the gala." "Why?" "You seemed comfortable with him." "He was easy to talk to." She didn't understand why her pulse had picked up. She hadn't done anything. "He knew about the Monet acquisition. We talked about art." "He touched your hand." There it was. Claire turned fully to face him. He was making a point. It was a social gesture. It lasted about 2 seconds, and it meant nothing. "I didn't say it meant something." "Then why are we having this conversation?" Vincent looked at her for a long moment. He had eyes that were hard to read under normal circumstances, dark gray, the kind that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and right now they were completely unreadable. He was still in his jacket. He hadn't loosened his tie. He looked exactly as controlled and assembled as he always did, except for the fact that they were having this conversation at all, which was already more deviation from their usual silence than she'd experienced in months. "You smiled at him," Vincent said. "The way you smile. The real one." She didn't know what to say to that. "You smiled at him the way you used to smile at the museum docents when you thought I wasn't watching. The way you smiled at the Italian ambassador's wife at the state dinner. When you're actually happy." He paused. "Not performing happy, actually." The rain was hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows hard enough that she could hear it over the climate control. Somewhere far below, New York continued being New York, indifferent to the particular silence filling this room. "You've been watching how I smile," she said. "I notice things." "Vincent." She said his name carefully, the way she might say it if she were diffusing something. "I talked to a man at a charity event for 12 minutes. Nothing happened." "I know nothing happened." "Then what is this about?" He crossed the living room. Not toward her. He stopped about 6 feet away, which was his version of close, she'd learned. He shoved both hands in his pockets, which she had never once seen him do before, and he looked at the floor between them for a moment before he looked back up at her. "He gave you 12 minutes of his full attention," Vincent said, "and you lit up." The words landed strangely. She felt them more than she understood them at first. I'm not accusing you of anything." His jaw worked once. "I'm telling you what I saw." "What you saw," she repeated slowly, "was your wife talking to someone at a party." "What I saw," he said, "was my wife talking to someone who actually looked at her, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I—" He stopped. The sentence just stopped. He didn't finish it. He pressed his lips together and looked past her toward the window, and the muscle in his throat moved once. Claire stood very still. Because in 18 months of living with this man, through the dinners and the charity events and the security briefings and the suffocating careful distance he maintained at all times, in 18 months of being married to Vincent Callahan, she had never once heard him not finish a sentence because he couldn't. "Vincent," she said. "Go to bed, Claire." He was already turning toward his study. "I apologize for—" "It was nothing. Go to bed." "You started to say something." "I said it was nothing." "You said you couldn't remember the last time you—" She took a breath. "Finish the sentence." He had his hand on the study door. He didn't open it. He stood there with his back to her, his shoulders very straight, the way they always were, and she watched the small shift in his posture that happened when he was deciding something. "The last time I looked at you," he said to the door, the way he did. Then he went into the study and closed the door quietly behind him. Claire sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before she moved again. The rain was still going. The city lights made the ceiling above her glow slightly, that ambient orange-gray that was as close to dark as Manhattan ever got. She thought about the 12 minutes with Richard Blackwell, his questions about the Monet, the easy rhythm of real conversation, the normalcy of a man making eye contact and listening when she responded. She thought about how that normalcy had felt almost startling after so long. Then she thought about Vincent in his study on the other side of 2 closed doors and 40 feet of hallway, and what he just admitted without quite admitting it. She had married him because her father had asked her to. That was the truth she had packaged into something more dignified over the past 18 months. She'd called it an arrangement, a mutual benefit, a strategic alliance between the Whitmore name and the Callahan resources. She'd told herself she'd done it with open eyes. What she had not told herself, because it was the kind of thing that didn't survive being looked at directly, was that she had hoped it might become something. Not a fairy tale. She wasn't 20 anymore, but something. And instead she had gotten 18 months of a man who remembered to have her car brought around in the rain and always ensured she had a security detail she didn't want and never once in all that time looked at her. Until tonight, when another man did. She lay back on the bed with her dress still on and stared at the glowing ceiling and didn't sleep for a long time. In the study, she heard nothing. She never did. Vincent Callahan existed on the other side of walls and made no sound that she could hear, which she had long ago decided was probably a professional skill. She didn't know that on the other side of those walls, he was sitting at his desk without turning on his computer, without picking up his phone, without doing any of the 40 things that typically demanded his attention past midnight. She didn't know that he had poured 2 fingers of whiskey and not touched it. She didn't know that his security chief had knocked twice, been sent away without explanation, or that Marcus had exchanged a glance with the other night guard that meant something is different and neither of them knew what. She didn't know any of that. She only knew that in 18 months of silence, her husband had just said something real, and she had no idea what to do with it. The first briefing came at 7 the next morning. Claire was in the kitchen. She always made her own breakfast, because she'd learned quickly that having staff do it made her feel managed in a way she couldn't tolerate. When Leo Bastian appeared in the kitchen doorway. Leo was Vincent's operations director and the man who conveyed all information that Vincent apparently could not be troubled to convey himself. He was 45, always in a dark suit, and had the energy of someone who had given up expecting the day to be anything other than complicated. Mr. Callahan has asked me to let you know that the Foundation Gala last night created some security considerations, Leo said. He's requested that your schedule be cleared for the next 48 hours while his team does an assessment. Claire poured her coffee and did not look up. What kind of security considerations? He didn't specify. Of course he didn't. She set the coffee pot down. Leo, Richard Blackwell. Who is he? The briefest pause. I'm not sure that's... I talked to the man for 12 minutes at a charity event. My husband then came home and interrogated me about the encounter at midnight. I think I'm entitled to know who I was apparently talking to. Leo looked at the wall, which was his tell, the thing he did when he was deciding how much truth fit inside his instructions. Mr. Blackwell is a businessman with interests in logistics and real estate, he said. He has a long history with several of the same markets that the Callahan organization operates in. You're describing a competitor. He's someone Mr. Callahan monitors closely. That's a yes. Claire picked up her coffee. What does closely monitored mean in this context? Mrs. Callahan, Leo's voice was careful. I think this is a conversation better had with your husband. My husband closed a door in my face at midnight and then apparently dispatched you at 7 in the morning to tell me my schedule is canceled. So, she looked at him directly. Tell me what you can actually tell me. Leo's jaw moved once. Then, Mr. Blackwell has made several recent moves that suggest he's interested in destabilizing the Callahan organization's position in several key markets. Last night's encounter may not have been coincidental. The coffee was good. She focused on that for a moment. He came to the gala specifically to talk to me. That's what Mr. Callahan believes. And he didn't think to tell me this himself. He was engaged this morning, early. He was avoiding me, Claire said. Leo said nothing. She set down the mug. The morning light through the kitchen window was gray and flat, the city still wet from last night's rain, and she stood there processing the information reorganizing itself in her head. Richard Blackwell, funny and attentive and perfectly calibrated, asking her about Monet like he'd researched her beforehand because he had researched her. The 12 minutes taking on a completely different shape in retrospect. She had been used as intelligence, or as bait, or both. And Vincent, standing in the living room at midnight with his hands in his pockets saying things he couldn't quite finish. Vincent had been afraid of something. She thought she understood what. Now she wasn't sure. "Where's my husband?" she said. "He has meetings until Leo." She picked up the coffee again. "Where is he right now? This minute?" Another pause. Leo was good at pauses the way some people were good at card games. His office, 42nd floor. She was in the elevator 12 minutes later, still in yesterday's clothes that she'd slept in, hair pulled back in a way she hadn't bothered to check in a mirror. The security team in the lobby had clearly been told to let her pass, because Marco only nodded once and stepped back, and she rode 42 floors up with the particular clarity of someone who had stopped managing her own reactions and was moving entirely on momentum. The receptionist started to rise from her desk. Claire said "don't" without slowing down and opened the inner office door. Vincent was at his desk. Across from him sat two men she didn't recognize, both in their 50s, both with the expensive, understated look of serious money. Everyone looked up. Vincent's expression changed once, fast, something moving behind his eyes before his face locked back into its professional setting. He stood. "Claire, I need 5 minutes. I'm in the middle of—" "I know you are. I need 5 minutes." The two men exchanged a look. Vincent's jaw tightened. He said to them, "Excuse me," and came around the desk, and she backed up to let him out of the office, and they stood in the narrow hallway between his office and the conference room while his assistant disappeared as efficiently as furniture. "You knew," Claire said. "Last night, you knew who Richard Blackwell was when you saw him with me." Vincent said nothing. "That whole conversation, you interrogating me at midnight, the thing you said—" She stopped, recalibrated. "You knew he'd been watching me. You knew why." "I suspected." "That's not—" She exhaled. "How long has he been watching me? How long have you known I was a target?" "Claire, how long, Vincent?" The hallway was quiet. The sound of the city was 42 floors below them, completely inaudible up here. Vincent looked at her the way he'd looked at the door last night, like he was on the other side of something and trying to decide whether to open it. 3 weeks, he said. She absorbed that. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of knowing she was being monitored by a dangerous man, of knowing she might be used as leverage, of knowing the threat was circling closer, and he had said nothing, not a word, not even a shift in the careful, invisible perimeter he maintained around her at all times. "You were protecting me," she said. "Yes." "By not telling me." "By not—" He stopped, tried again. "If you didn't know there was a threat, you wouldn't behave like someone who knew there was a threat, which meant Blackwell would underestimate how much you knew, which gave us an advantage." It was a perfectly logical explanation. She recognized it as such, and she also recognized what it cost her. "You used me," she said, "without telling me, to get information. I kept you safe. You kept me ignorant." The words came out quieter than she intended, which was somehow worse. "Vincent, I was his pawn last night, and I was yours. And the only difference is that you're my husband." The office door at the end of the hall opened, and one of the men leaned out with the carefully apologetic expression of someone interrupting something they'd been told not to interrupt. "Mr. Callahan, Hong Kong is holding." Vincent looked at Claire. Claire looked back. "Go," she said. "Answer the call. We're done." She walked back to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited with her back to him. She heard him stand there for a moment, heard it somehow, the quality of stillness, and then heard him go back into the office. On the ride down, she pressed her back against the elevator wall and looked at the ceiling and thought, 3 weeks. She thought, he noticed how I smiled, but he didn't think to tell me I was being hunted. She thought about what that meant, about a man who could hold two things simultaneously, the jealousy and the strategy, the feeling and the calculation, and which one he'd trusted more. The lobby doors opened into gray morning air, and her driver was waiting at the curb because of course he was. Vincent never missed that detail. She got into the car and said home, and the driver nodded and pulled out into traffic. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the city go past, and felt the thing she had been carefully not feeling for 18 months begin to shift in its container. She wasn't sure yet whether what was moving was anger or grief or something else entirely. She thought it might be all three. And underneath all three, very quietly, pressed flat by 18 months of careful distance and silence and performed contentment, she thought it might also be the beginning of something she wasn't ready to name yet. The car moved uptown through morning traffic. The rain had stopped. The streets were still wet, and every surface threw light back in ways it wouldn't later when everything dried and went back to ordinary. She watched the reflection streak past the window and thought about 12 minutes with a man who had looked at her on purpose, and a midnight hallway with a man who had looked at her by accident, and the difference between those two things. She was still trying to figure out which one scared her more when the car pulled up to the building and Marcus held the door open and the ordinary machinery of her extraordinary, suffocating life resumed around her again. 3 days passed, and Vincent didn't come home before midnight once. Claire knew because she stopped sleeping before 2, which was new. She'd always been a solid sleeper, one of the few things about herself she'd considered reliable. Now she lay in the dark and listened to the elevator, counting the hours. And when she finally heard the mechanical hum of it arriving at the penthouse floor, she'd look at her phone and the number was always wrong. Always too late or too early or just wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. She didn't go out to meet him. He didn't come to her door. The penthouse resumed its ordinary silence, and she lay there with her eyes open and thought about 3 weeks and the particular arithmetic of being kept safe by being kept ignorant. On the 4th day, Leo appeared again at breakfast. Mr. Callahan would like to discuss a temporary relocation, he said, before she could speak. She set down her spoon. Relocation. A precautionary measure. There's a private estate in the Catskills. It's been used before for... Am I in danger, Leo? He looked at the wall. She'd learned to watch for that. The assessment team has identified some concerns about the penthouse's exposure in light of... Yes or no? His throat moved. Mr. Callahan believes precaution is warranted at this stage. That's a yes. She picked up her spoon again. The oatmeal had gone cold. When? He'd like to move you by end of week. And did he consider telling me this himself? Leo said nothing, which was its own answer. She looked at the window, at the Manhattan skyline doing its ordinary thing outside, the usual impossible sprawl of it, and she thought about being moved to a private estate in the mountains like a piece of furniture being put in storage while the adults handled the situation. Tell him I want to speak with him first, she said. In person. Tonight. He has a full... Tonight, Leo. Or I don't go. He came home at 7, which was earlier than he'd been all week. She heard him speak to Marcus in the foyer, heard the low exchange, heard the pause that meant Marcus had relayed her message. Then footsteps, and he appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where she'd positioned herself deliberately. Not on the couch, where she'd looked passive, but in the chair by the window, where she could see his face in the remaining daylight. He'd loosened his tie. That was the only concession to the hour. Everything else was still fully assembled. You wanted to talk, he said. You're moving me to the mountains. The Catskills estate is secure. 8 guards, reinforced perimeter, remote location. It's the right call. I'm sure it is, she kept her voice even. I want to understand why. Blackwell made contact with 2 of my operations managers last week. He's not fishing anymore. He's positioning. Positioning for what? Vincent came into the room but didn't sit. He stood near the bookshelf, which was as close to neutral ground as the room had. He's building leverage. That means people around me become points of pressure. A pause. You're the most visible point of pressure I have. The word visible landed with a particular weight. She turned it over. Because we're married. Because we appear in public together. Because the foundation work puts you in rooms I'm not always in. Because... He stopped. Because he saw something last night, she said, at the gala. Vincent's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. The same shifting she'd seen in the elevator hallway. What Blackwell saw at the gala is exactly why he'll use you if he can. What did he see, Vincent? She wasn't asking about Blackwell now, and they both knew it. He looked out the window. The daylight was going orange and flat, that exhausted end-of-afternoon light that made everything look like it was running out of time. He saw that I reacted, Vincent said. Quiet. Final. Like closing a cabinet. She exhaled slowly. So you're sending me away because he knows you care whether something happens to me. I'm sending you away because if he takes you, I'll have to make choices that… He stopped again. This was becoming a pattern, she realized. Vincent Callahan, who ran negotiations across 3 states and managed a criminal infrastructure that terrified people with decades of experience, kept stopping in the middle of sentences around her. The estate is the right move. I need you somewhere I'm not worried about. You could have asked me, she said, instead of sending Leo. I know. Why didn't you? He looked at her then, actually looked, the gray eyes doing that thing where they took in more than they gave back. Because I knew you'd fight it. I am fighting it. I know. Vincent. She stood up because she needed to not be in that chair anymore. I've been in this marriage for 18 months, and I have never once asked you for anything. I have shown up to every event, maintained every public appearance, done everything Leo and your security team have ever asked me to do without question. I have lived in this penthouse like a very well-protected ghost. She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't smooth it out. And the first time something actually affects me, something I actually deserve to know about, you sent a memo. His throat moved. I was trying to protect me. I know, you say that, but what you actually did was manage me. She crossed her arms. Not defensive. She was cold suddenly, furious in a way that had moved past heat into something colder and more precise. There is a difference between protecting someone and controlling the information they're allowed to have. You know that. You just don't apply it to me. The room was very quiet. Outside, a siren somewhere, far below. The city going about its business. You're right, Vincent said. She hadn't expected that. It showed, probably. She saw his eyes track the surprise on her face. You're right, he said again, like he was testing the weight of it a second time. I handled it wrong. Yes. I'm still moving you to the estate. I know. She uncrossed her arms. I'll go, but I want a full briefing. Everything you know about Blackwell, everything the assessment team found, all of it, not filtered through Leo, from you. A long pause. She watched him weigh it. All right, he said. Tonight. Tonight. She nodded once and went to get her coat because she needed to be in motion, needed to move through something before the cold fury in her chest either expanded or collapsed. She wasn't sure which. And she heard him behind her, not following, just standing in the sitting room in the fading light, while the city kept going outside, and neither of them said anything else. The briefing lasted 2 hours. He spread files across the dining room table, actual physical files, printed and tabbed, the kind she hadn't seen before, and she understood that this was a concession. His world existed in encrypted channels and coded conversations, not on paper. Paper could be found. The fact that it was on her dining room table meant he was trusting her with something tangible. She sat across from him, and he talked. He talked differently than she'd expected. Not clinical, not the Leo-filtered version she was used to. He was direct, specific, and occasionally stopped to make sure she'd understood before moving on, which was more courtesy than most people got in a briefing, she suspected. Richard Blackwell had started in logistics on the West Coast 20 years ago, which was a clean way of saying he'd moved product through ports in ways that federal investigators had spent a decade trying to document and never quite managed. He'd moved east 8 years ago and spent the intervening time building relationships with everyone who had reason to want the Callahan organization weakened: competitors, disgruntled former associates, 2 specific federal units who wanted a cooperating witness more than a conviction. He's not building a business, Vincent said. He's building a coalition, everyone who wants a piece of what I've built, organized under one roof with him at the center. And the gala. He's been establishing himself in philanthropic circles for 2 years. Legitimate cover, legitimate access. Vincent turned a page. We believe he identified you specifically because of your foundation work. You're in rooms where he needs social credibility. He used me to legitimize himself. He used proximity to you. His jaw tightened slightly. The same way he used the conversation to get my reaction, confirm I had a weakness, document it. He paused. We recovered security footage from the gala. His table had a direct sightline to where you were standing. She thought about the 2 seconds of hand contact, the perfectly timed compliment about the Monet, the easy laugh, the real questions. He studied me, she said. Extensively, we think. How long has he been building this? 2 years of preparation, active moves in the last 6 months. Vincent closed the file. He's patient. That's what makes him more dangerous than most. She absorbed that. 2 years. And you've known about him for 14 months. Something shifted in her chest. Not surprise exactly. More like the confirmation of something she'd already begun to suspect. 14 months, she repeated. His initial interest in the organization. We didn't connect the focus on you specifically until 3 weeks ago. But for 14 months you knew there was someone building toward you. She looked at him. And you didn't change anything. You didn't... We kept going to events, I kept doing foundation work, nothing changed. Changing behavior signals awareness, signals fear. So I was... She stopped, rerouted. For 14 months, I was a visible asset in a situation you knew was becoming dangerous, and you calculated that using me as bait was worth more than telling me the truth. It wasn't calculated to... It doesn't have to be calculated to be true. She kept her voice flat because the alternative was something louder that wouldn't help either of them. Vincent, do you understand what you're describing? You made decisions about my safety, my exposure, my life for over a year without telling me. And the reason was strategy. His hands on the table were very still. She'd noticed that about him. When other people tensed up, their hands gave them away, fidgeting, gripping, moving. His went still. Yes, he said. Say it like you know what it means. He looked at her directly. The gray eyes, the deliberate face. I used your ignorance as a strategic asset for over a year. The dining room was quiet. Thank you, she said. It came out strange, half sincere, half something else she didn't have a word for. She stood up and started gathering the files because her hands needed something to do. He watched her without moving. She stacked them neatly, the way she always handled things that needed to be handled, and set them at the center of the table, and stood there with her palms flat on the wood. I'll be ready to move Friday, she said. I want the security detail briefing before we leave. I want to know the people's names, not just their functions. And I want communication, real communication, not through Leo, at least once a day while we're separated. A pause. We won't be separated. She looked up. What? I'll be at the estate. Once I've established the transition with the operations team. He held her gaze. I'm not putting you in a secure location and leaving you there alone. She wasn't sure what to do with that. It sat in her chest in an uncomfortable way, somewhere between relief and something more complicated. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They left Thursday, not Friday, because at 11:30 Wednesday night, Leo called and the conversation that followed was short enough that she could hear Vincent's clipped responses from down the hall, and long enough that she lay awake until 2 waiting for it to be over. In the morning, Marcus had the cars ready before 7. She came downstairs with her bags already packed and found Vincent in the kitchen, not at the table, standing, holding coffee he hadn't drunk, and his face had the tight, controlled look of someone who had been awake considerably longer than she had. What happened? She said. One of my operations managers didn't come home last night. She set her bag down. Blackwell. We don't know yet, but the timing. He set down the coffee. We need to move faster than planned. Okay. She picked up her bag again. Then let's go. He looked at her for a second. She caught it, the fractional pause, like he hadn't expected that. Like he'd expected argument or fear or questions he'd have to manage. She gave him none of those things because she was past the point of performing manageable, and because honestly, the fear was there, but it had resolved itself into something operational rather than paralyzing, which surprised her. The convoy was 3 cars, which was more than their usual 2. She noted that without commenting on it. The drive north took 2 hours through traffic that thinned progressively as Manhattan gave way to the Bronx to Westchester, Westchester to the kind of bare-armed trees and gray sky that meant they were genuinely outside the city now. Vincent sat beside her in the back of the middle vehicle and worked his phone in the silent, constant way she'd seen him work it at a dozen events, scrolling, reading, sending, receiving. And she looked out the window and let the landscape change and didn't try to fill the quiet. 40 minutes north of the city, he said, without looking up from his phone. You're not asking questions. You'll tell me what I need to know when you know it. A pause. He looked up from the phone. She didn't turn from the window. "That's a change," he said. "I'm adjusting my expectations." She watched a bare-limbed oak go past the window, massive and solitary at the edge of someone's property. "You're not good at volunteering information. I'm not going to keep asking for something you're not built to give. So I'll ask when I need something specific, and the rest of the time I'll assume you're handling it." That's... He stopped. "That sounds like giving up." "It's not." She did turn then, looked at him directly. "It's deciding which fights matter. The fight I want to have with you is not about your communication style. It's about the year of strategy that used my ignorance. That one I'm still angry about. But being angry about your phone habits on a 2-hour drive is a different category." He looked at her for a moment that stretched past comfortable. "You've been thinking about this." "I've had 3 days of not sleeping. Yes." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the ghost of one. The echo of a reflex that didn't get much use. "I'm sorry," he said. "About the 3 days. Were you actually managing something, or were you hiding?" "Both," he said, which was the most honest answer she'd gotten from him in 18 months and landed accordingly. She turned back to the window. "Both," she said. "Okay." The estate appeared at the end of a half-mile private road behind a gate. She saw 3 cameras covering from different angles. The property was large and old, a converted 19th century house with newer additions that made no attempt to match the original architecture and were clearly functional rather than aesthetic. She counted the guards she could see from the car, 4 plus the 2 who opened the gate, and understood there were more she couldn't see. Inside, the house was cleaner than she'd expected. Not warm, but not institutional. Someone had put fresh flowers in the main room, which struck her as an oddly human touch in an otherwise tactical environment. She looked at them and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, just slightly, the way a knotted muscle does when heat is finally applied. Donna, the estate's domestic manager, a compact woman in her 60s with an unreadable face and efficient hands, showed her to a room on the 2nd floor that had a window looking east over the property. Not a view exactly, more a surveillance advantage, but the morning light would be good, and the bed was a real bed, not institutional. She thanked Donna, and Donna nodded and left, and Claire stood in the room for a moment listening to the new silence, which was different from the penthouse silence, less pressurized, more like actual quiet. Vincent's room was across the hall. She knew because Leo had mentioned it while running through the security protocol. Across the hall, which in the architecture of their marriage was approximately the same distance they'd always maintained, relocated to the countryside. She unpacked methodically. She had always been a methodical unpacker. Her mother had called it the only organizational habit worth keeping, and the act of placing things in drawers was grounding in a way she needed. She was hanging her second dress when she heard the raised voices downstairs. Not loud. Vincent's voice never got loud in the way most people's did, but raised was different. Raised meant stripped of the controlled register he maintained at all times, and the sound of it made her stop with the hanger in her hand and listen. She couldn't make out words. She could make out rhythm, confrontational, short, the sound of a conversation where someone was being told something they didn't want to be told. She put the hanger down and went to the door. In the hallway, she could hear it better. Vincent and Leo, she thought, though Leo's voice was different too. Tighter, more compressed. She moved to the top of the stairs and heard, "Confirmed an hour ago, they found the car." And Vincent's response, quieter, which was worse. "Where?" And Leo, "Jersey side. Weehawken. The car was clean, but Marcus's read on the method is, don't." Vincent's voice, very flat. "Not in the house." A pause. Then footsteps. And the sound of a door. She stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, then went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the operations manager who hadn't come home, and what clean car and method implied when they were spoken in those voices. The methodical unpacking she'd been doing as an anchor suddenly seemed like a very thin thing to hold on to. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when there was a knock at her door. Not Leo's knock, not Donna's. And she said, "Come in," and Vincent opened the door and stood in the frame. He looked different than he had in the car. Something had happened to his face in the last 20 minutes, some additional tightening, and she saw it and read it and felt the cold in her chest come back. "Tell me," she said. "Marco Reyes is dead." He said it straight, without softening. He was one of my senior operations managers. He'd been with the organization for 11 years. Blackwell. The method is consistent with people he's used before. We don't have proof yet. But you know, yes. He came into the room and stopped near the window, turned to face her. He was carrying the information in his body. She could see it. The set of his shoulders, the slightly shallower breath. This changes the situation. He's not probing anymore. He's moving. What does that mean for us? Here. This location is still secure. The level of security goes up. Some of my other senior people will be relocating to properties we control while we assess the full extent of... He stopped, jaw tight. Marco had a daughter, 8 years old. She hadn't expected that. The rawness of it dropped into the tactical rundown without warning. Vincent, she said, I've already had someone contact his wife. She's being moved tonight. He said it like he was closing a door on that specific thing, the grief of it, boxing it up to be handled later. I need you to understand what we're dealing with. Blackwell isn't only building leverage. He's demonstrating willingness. That's a different kind of enemy. She looked at him standing at the window of this borrowed room in this tactical house, and she thought about the flowers downstairs that someone had put in the main room, and she thought about an 8-year-old girl, and she thought about 14 months of strategic silence. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her like the question surprised him, like nobody had asked him that in a long time, maybe ever. Nothing, he said. I just needed you to know. That's the second time this week you've told me something without being asked. She held his gaze. It's different. I want you to know I notice. His throat moved. Something in his expression shifted in that way she'd started to catalog. The almost movement, the thing that would be a feeling if he'd let it surface. Claire. His voice was low, careful. When this is over, when Blackwell is handled and everything is... He stopped. There are things I've kept from you that are worse than the 3 weeks. She felt the cold in her chest crystallize into something specific and sharp. How much worse? She said. He held her gaze and didn't look away, which meant he knew exactly what he was about to do to the fragile thing they had barely begun to build. Your father, he said, and why he really came to me. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd heard in years. She heard her own breath. She heard the wind picking up outside the estate, rattling the old window frame. She heard the distant movement of the security team on the grounds, the ordinary machinery of protection continuing its ordinary work. She looked at her husband's face and understood that whatever came next, whatever he was about to tell her, would change the shape of everything she thought she knew about how she'd ended up in this room, in this marriage, in this life. Tell me now, she said, and Vincent Callahan, who had spent his entire adult life managing what information people were allowed to have, looked at his wife across 8 feet of borrowed floor and finally, at enormous cost, began. He didn't sit down. That was the first thing she noticed. Vincent remained standing near the window, like he needed to be able to move, like he couldn't afford to be settled in a chair for what he was about to say. 18 months of watching this man in every social situation imaginable had taught her to read his posture the way other people read faces, and right now his posture said, "This is going to cost me something I can't get back." Your father came to me 2 years before the arrangement, Vincent said. Not through intermediaries. He came to my office. Personally. She waited. He had debts. Not business debts. Gambling. The kind that accumulate in places that don't send formal notices. 3 separate organizations, all of them with methods of collection that don't involve courts. A pause. He owed approximately $4 million across the 3. One of those organizations was loosely affiliated with my operations through a shared territory agreement, which is how he knew to come to me. Claire sat very still on the edge of the bed. Her hands were in her lap and she was looking at them rather than at him, because she needed to not be looking at his face for this part. He came to ask for consolidation, Vincent continued. He wanted me to buy his debts from the other 2 organizations, clear his exposure with them. In exchange, he stopped, started again. He offered a business partnership, his family name, his social connections, access to certain philanthropic networks. On paper, it looked like a straightforward arrangement. On paper, she said, the debt was $4 million. The value of what he was offering in terms of legitimate cover and social access was worth considerably more than that to my operations at the time. The FBI had been building a case for 18 months. I needed, the optics required, a different kind of public face. He said it flatly, the way he said everything when he was being most careful. Your father knew that. She looked up then. She couldn't help it. He knew what you needed. He'd done his research. He knew about the federal investigation. He came in with exactly what I required, and he priced it accordingly. Something moved through Vincent's face. Not disgust exactly, more like the expression of someone who has long ago made peace with a specific truth and doesn't find it surprising anymore, only heavy. He was a better negotiator than most people I deal with. He understood leverage. And the arrangement, she said. The word tasted strange. The marriage. It was his proposal, not mine. The wind hit the window again. She heard it and didn't register it and heard it again. He proposed using me, she said. He framed it as a family alliance, a social arrangement that would benefit both parties. He described you as... Vincent's jaw tightened. He described you as someone who understood duty, who would be reliable, who wouldn't cause difficulty. The specific words landed like something physical. Reliable. Wouldn't cause difficulty. Her father had sold her with a character reference. He needed the marriage to make the arrangement permanent, Vincent said. A business deal can be dissolved. A marriage, especially a public one, with the social coverage it provided, was a structural element. It signaled stability to the people watching my organization. It signaled respectability. And you agreed. I agreed to consider it. I had my people investigate the Whitmore family thoroughly. He stopped. I looked into you. You investigated me before we met. Yes. She thought about their first meeting, the dinner her father had arranged, the restaurant she'd thought her father had chosen because it was her favorite, the careful way the evening had been structured so that she and Vincent were seated together and the conversation had room to develop. She had thought she was being introduced to a potential match. She had thought her father was trying to take care of her in the blunt, imperfect way he'd always tried to take care of her. He told me it was about finding me a stable match, she said. He said he was worried about me, that I'd spent 3 years post-Columbia doing work I was overqualified for, and he wanted me to have security. Vincent said nothing. He wasn't worried about me, she said. No. She stood up. She didn't do it dramatically. She just needed to not be sitting. She walked to the far side of the room, which wasn't far, 8 feet, and stood facing the wall for a moment before turning back. You investigated me, agreed to the arrangement, and then what? You sat across from me at that dinner and made a decision. I made a decision before the dinner, after my people's report. I'd already decided to... He paused on the word. To proceed. So the dinner was a formality. For me. And for him. For him, yes. She thought about her father at that dinner. The way he'd been more animated than usual. The way he'd laughed too quickly at things Vincent said that weren't that funny. The performance of a man auditioning. She'd thought he was nervous about her, nervous that she'd say something that would put off the eligible match he'd found. She'd been charmed by his nervousness. She'd tried to be easier, more open, warmer than she typically was with strangers. She had performed warmth to save a dinner that was actually a transaction. Did he tell you I didn't know? She said. He told me you understood the nature of arranged marriages and would be... Vincent stopped. His voice had gone very careful. He implied your awareness. He lied to you about that. A pause. Yes. I determined that later. When? Approximately 3 weeks after the wedding. He held her gaze. Your behavior made it clear that you hadn't been fully briefed on the nature of the arrangement, the questions you weren't asking, the way you were trying to... He stopped. The way I was trying to make it work, she said, like I thought it was a real marriage. Yes. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked at him and felt the particular vertigo of a person who has just discovered that the floor they've been walking on for 18 months was never what it appeared to be. Not solid ground. A construction, built beneath her while she was standing on it, so she never felt the building happen. You knew I didn't know, she said, 3 weeks in, and you didn't tell me. No. Because... She stopped herself. She could feel the anger trying to take a shape that would just be noise, just heat, and heat wouldn't get her what she needed right now. She breathed once. Tell me why. Vincent moved away from the window for the first time. He came to the center of the room and stopped there, and she saw the cost of this in his body, the way his hands were at his sides, not in his pockets, not controlled into stillness, just present in a way that was almost naked for him. Because telling you the truth meant telling you your father had sold you to manage his gambling debts, and you would have gone to him. And if you'd gone to him angry and he'd panicked, he paused. He still knew things about the arrangement that could have been used against me. At a time when the federal investigation was at its most active, I couldn't afford the exposure. She heard it. She made sure she actually heard it before she responded. You protected yourself. Yes. You're telling me that too. You asked for the truth. All of it. She walked to the window and stood where he'd been standing. The estate grounds were going dark in the early evening, the security team's flashlights tracking their patrol routes at the perimeter, small moving lights in the growing dark. She watched them for a moment. My father is still alive, she said. Yes. Does he know you know that he lied to you about my awareness? We've never discussed it directly. So for 18 months, the three of us have been... She almost laughed. It came out wrong. Not like amusement, more like a body releasing pressure. We've all been performing for each other. Him pretending it was a real introduction. Me pretending it was a real marriage. You pretending you didn't know any of it. Yes. That's... She turned from the window. That's almost impressive, in a terrible way. Claire, don't. She held up her hand. Don't manage this right now. Just let me have a minute. He closed his mouth. He stood in the center of the room and let her have the minute, which was maybe the most useful thing he'd done for her in 18 months. She used it to stand at the window and watch the lights and feel the full dimension of what had just been handed to her. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, who had called her every Sunday her entire adult life, who kept a photo of her mother on his desk that he'd never been willing to replace even after a decade. Thomas Whitmore had accumulated $4 million in gambling debts with criminal organizations and solved the problem by using his daughter as a bargaining chip, and then told her it was love. The minute was not enough. She took two more. When she turned back, Vincent was still standing exactly where she'd left him. I want to call my father, she said. Something crossed his face. Claire, I know it's not secure. I know the timing is bad. I know there are 12 reasons why that's the wrong call right now. I still want to make it. I'm not going to stop you. He said it carefully. But I need you to hear something first. She waited. Blackwell knows about the debts. The three organizations your father borrowed from. At least one of them has since aligned with Blackwell's coalition, which means Blackwell has the documentation, the original terms. Everything. He paused. He knows exactly how this marriage was structured, and he knows your father is the most vulnerable point in the arrangement. The meaning assembled itself slowly, then all at once. He'll use my father. He already may be. We don't know where Thomas is tonight. Something cold moved through her that was different from the anger of 5 minutes ago. More animal, more immediate. What do you mean you don't know where he is? His housekeeper reported he left this morning. Didn't say where. Hasn't answered his phone since noon. Vincent's voice was very level, the levelness of someone keeping it level with deliberate effort. Leo has people trying to locate him. It may be nothing. He goes to his club, sometimes doesn't surface for hours, but given the timing of Marco Reyes, she said. Yes. She picked up her phone, called her father's number. It rang 8 times and went to voicemail, the familiar recorded voice asking her to leave a message, and she stood there holding the phone after the beep without saying anything, and then ended the call. She called again. 8 rings. Voicemail. Vincent, she said. Her voice had changed. She heard it, the anger gone now completely, replaced by something more stripped down and frightened. Find him. We're already, find him tonight. He crossed to her and took the phone gently from her hand and set it on the dresser, and she let him, and for a moment they were standing very close together, the closest they'd been since their wedding photograph, and she could see the line of his jaw and the dark circles that had appeared under his eyes in the last several days, and she thought, this man has been carrying all of this alone, and he looks exactly the way that feels. I'm going to find him, Vincent said, low. I promise you. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice right then. He stepped back and was on his own phone before he'd reached the door, speaking in that clipped, direct way that meant he was talking to someone who understood. Each word had a specific operational meaning, and she sat back down on the edge of the bed and held herself very still and waited. The call came at 11:47. She was in the hallway outside Vincent's temporary office. He'd commandeered the estate's library, which now had 3 laptops and a whiteboard covered in names she only partially recognized. When she heard his voice change registers, she'd been awake against the wall, not eavesdropping exactly, more using proximity as a substitute for information, and the change in his voice made her push off the wall and move closer to the door. She heard, "When?" Then, "How long ago?" Then silence, which was the worst thing. Then his voice very quiet, something she had to put her ear near the door to catch. "Don't move him yet. I'm coming." She stepped back from the door before it opened. He came out and nearly walked into her, and they stood in the hallway, and she looked at his face and knew. "He has my father," she said. "We believe so." Someone matching his description was identified at a property Blackwell controls in New Jersey. "One of our contacts." He stopped. Reformulated. "Someone in a position to observe the property confirmed a guest arrival matching your father's description approximately 4 hours ago." 4 hours. Her father had been there since 7 o'clock, since before dinner. While she was eating food she barely tasted in the estate kitchen and telling herself no news was probably fine, her father had been in a building controlled by a man who had already killed one person this week to send a message. Is he... The description suggested he was ambulatory, walking under his own power. Vincent's eyes were steady on hers. He was giving her the information cleanly, without softening, and she was grateful for it in a way she hadn't expected to be grateful for anything tonight. That likely means Blackwell wants him functional. He's leverage, not a message. "He's bait," she said. "Yes." She absorbed that. Her father, regardless of what he'd done, regardless of the 4 million and the lie and the transaction dressed up as love, her father was 70 years old and had a bad knee and collected first-edition mystery novels and called her every Sunday, and he was in a building in New Jersey being used as bait. "What does Blackwell want?" she said. "He hasn't made contact yet. He'll wait. Make us anxious." Vincent's voice carried a familiar contempt. Not emotional, clinical, the contempt of someone who has read this playbook before and knows its limitations. "He wants me reactive. He wants me to move before I've thought it through." "Are you going to?" "No." He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world. "I'm going to think it through." She looked at him in the hallway of this borrowed house with its borrowed security and its borrowed quiet, and she thought, this man has been building walls his entire life, and I have been behind them for 18 months, and until 3 days ago I thought the walls were between us, but they were around us, both of us. "Tell me what you need," she said. "I need you to stay here." "That's not... Claire." His voice dropped. "What I need from you right now, the thing that will actually help me, is knowing you are in this building, inside this perimeter, not a variable I have to account for. If I know you're safe, I can think clearly. If you're not..." He stopped. "I've already lost one person this week. I need to know where you are." She wanted to argue. She felt the argument in her chest, the reasonable shape of it. "I'm not a variable. I'm a person. This is my father." And she held it there and looked at his face, at the exhaustion and the control, and the thing underneath. Both that she still didn't have a name for, and she said, "Okay." He looked at her like he'd expected the argument, like the absence of it landed somewhere unexpected. "Thank you," he said, and it came out quiet enough that it felt real. She went back to her room. She sat on the bed and she did not sleep, and she listened to the controlled chaos of the library across the hall. The voices, the phone calls, the occasional sharp instruction from Vincent cutting through quieter discussion. And she thought about her father selling her like a good business asset, and she thought about her husband keeping the truth from her for 18 months to protect his operations. And she thought about a man in New Jersey who had spent 2 years building a coalition specifically designed to break the people in this house. She thought, every person in this situation had lied to her, some with calculation, some with what they called protection, some for pure self-interest. And she had moved through all of it thinking she understood the shape of her own life. At 1:15 in the morning, she heard Vincent's voice cut off mid-sentence. Dead silence. Then his voice again, very quiet, asking someone to repeat what they'd just said. She was out of bed and in the hall before she'd decided to move. The library door was open. Leo was at one of the laptops, face pale in the screen's light. Two other men she knew only as part of the security detail flanked the room. Vincent stood at the center with a phone pressed to his ear, and when he looked up and saw her in the doorway, his expression did something she had never seen it do before. He looked afraid. Not afraid for himself. She understood the difference, even then, even in that first second. The way his eyes went to her, and the fear was already there before they landed, already present before she appeared. It wasn't triggered by her seeing it. He'd been afraid before she walked in, and seeing her just meant he couldn't contain it. "What happened?" she said. He lowered the phone. Leo looked at the screen. The two security men looked at everything except either of them. "Three of my senior people," Vincent said, "in the last 2 hours. Not dead. Turned." He said the word with a specific precision that meant something worse than the word's face value. "Blackwell has been building inside the organization for months. People I trusted, people who have been with me for years, have been feeding him information, positions, schedules, security rotations." He stopped. "The estate's location." The cold moved through her stomach. "He knows we're here," she said. "He's known since we arrived." She heard her own heartbeat. She heard the wind outside, stronger now, the old window frames creaking under it. She heard one of the security men shift his weight. "Then we're not safe here," she said. "We have maybe 2 hours before he decides whether to move on the property or use your father to draw me out." Vincent's eyes were on her, steady, the fear she'd seen replaced by something that was running on calculation now. "If I move you again, he tracks us. If I stay here, he controls the timeline." "Then you make him lose the timeline," she said. He looked at her. "You stop waiting for him to move." She held his gaze. "You go to my father, tonight, before he expects you to have figured it out." Walking into his location is exactly what he wants. "Walking in unprepared is what he wants," she said. "Going in on your own terms right now before he's ready for you. That's different." The room was very quiet. Leo had turned from the laptop and was watching them both. Vincent looked at her for a long moment. The duration of it felt like something being decided, not about tactics. She understood he was already running the tactics in his head at a speed she'd never be able to follow. Something else was being decided. Something about what he was allowed to need and who was allowed to see it. "I might not come back," he said. Flat, not dramatic. A factual statement, the way he'd delivered every fact she'd received from him. She felt it move through her. Let it move. "Then you need to go right now, while there's still time to make sure you do." He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he said to Leo, "Get the team ready. We leave in 15 minutes. And to the security men, double the interior perimeter. Nobody in or out until I authorize it personally." And he was already moving toward the door, already on his phone, already the operational version of himself that lived on frequencies she couldn't hear. He stopped in the doorway. He was facing away from her. He stood there for 1 second, 2, and she watched the set of his shoulders and waited. He turned his head. Not fully. Just enough. Profile, edge of jaw, the dark gray eye catching the lamplight for a moment. "Don't open the door for anyone," he said, "no matter what they tell you." Then he was gone. She stood in the library in the middle of the night in a house that was no longer safe and listened to the organized sound of men preparing for something she couldn't follow. And she thought about her father in New Jersey and her husband moving toward danger on a timeline that was already someone else's design. And she thought about 18 months of distance and lies and careful management and the 2 seconds in a doorway where none of that was present. Just a man turning to say one more thing before he walked into something he might not walk out of. The window in the library rattled hard once, the wind pressing against the glass like a question, and then the house went very quiet in the particular way that houses go quiet when the people who fill them have suddenly left. And Claire Whitmore Callahan stood in the silence and understood for the first time with absolute clarity what she stood to lose. The 15 minutes felt like 4. Claire stood at the library window and watched the convoy assemble in the dark below. 3 vehicles, men moving between them with the particular efficiency of people who had done this before and knew that speed mattered more than composure. She counted 7 going out. Vincent was the last one to the cars, and she watched him cross the gravel in the dark, and get into the second vehicle without looking up at the window. And then the convoy moved and the gate opened and the red taillights went down the private road and disappeared into the trees. The estate went quiet in a way that had weight to it. 2 security men remained inside. She knew because Leo had told her before he left with Vincent. 2 inside, 4 on the perimeter, rotating every 40 minutes. She'd nodded like this information was useful to her, like she could do something with it. And then Leo had left too, and she'd been standing at this window ever since. Her phone showed 2:17 in the morning. She thought about calling her father again. She didn't because Vincent had said don't use the phone unnecessarily, the signal could be tracked, and she was making a genuine effort to do the things that would actually help, rather than the things that would only make her feel less helpless. She went to the kitchen and made tea she didn't want because the act of making it required specific small movements that kept her hands occupied. The kitchen was large and old and smelled like whatever Donna had cooked earlier, and the overhead light was harsh and yellow and made everything look like a different decade. She stood at the counter with the mug warming her palms and listened to the house breathe around her. The security man, young, 20s, hadn't given a name, appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, "Mrs. Callahan, you should stay in the interior rooms." "This is an interior room," she said. He looked at the window over the sink. She looked at it too. Dark glass. The grounds invisible beyond the reflection of the kitchen light. "The room without exterior windows," he said. She picked up her tea. "All right." The interior room he meant was a small sitting room off the main hallway. No windows, 2 chairs, a lamp with a weak bulb, a bookshelf with paperback thrillers that someone had accumulated over what looked like several decades of use. She sat in one of the chairs and looked at the spines of the books and didn't read any of them. 304, 319, 331. At 3:47 her phone lit up. Unknown number. She stared at it for 2 full rings, then answered. "Mrs. Callahan." The voice was smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided long ago that rushing was a form of weakness. She recognized it immediately, and her whole body went still in the way it goes still before something painful. "I hope the estate is comfortable. It's a beautiful property. I've always thought so." Richard Blackwell. She didn't speak. She was running through everything Vincent had told her about him. Patient, deliberate, reads reactions. And she understood that her silence right now was the only asset she had. "Your husband left about 40 minutes ago," Blackwell said. "I imagine he told you he had a plan." A pause, easy, like a man settling into a comfortable chair. "He does. It's a good plan, actually. He's better at this than most people give him credit for." Another pause. "It won't work." "What do you want?" she said. Flat, no inflection. "Your father is fine, if that's what you're about to ask. He's had dinner, he's watching television, genuinely. I'm not being ironic. He's a man who adapts quickly to circumstances, your father. You probably know that about him." She felt the specific cruelty of that sentence, the way it was designed to land on the exact truth she'd just learned tonight, and she made herself breathe through it. "Richard," she used his first name deliberately, watched herself do it. "Tell me what you want." "I want your husband to understand that what he built was always contingent," Blackwell said. "Empires built on fear have a structural weakness. The moment someone stops being afraid, the whole thing shifts. I've spent 2 years making people stop being afraid of Vincent Callahan." A small pause. "Tonight is the demonstration." "Then why call me?" "Because you're the interesting variable." His voice didn't change register, but something in it did. Sharpened slightly, the way a camera lens sharpens when it finds its actual subject. 2 years ago, I started building this because I understood Vincent's organization and I understood his weaknesses. But 18 months ago, something changed that I didn't anticipate. She waited. "He married you," Blackwell said, "and I thought that was strategic. I thought I understood it. A legitimate face, social cover, the usual architecture." A pause. "I was wrong. Watching him at the gala, watching his face when I touched your hand, I realized Vincent Callahan made a mistake. He let it become real." "What do you want from me?" she said again. "I want you to tell him to stop." The voice remained smooth, unhurried. "Call him. Tell him to stand down and go home. I'll release your father in the morning, no harm done, and I'll give your husband a clean exit from the territories I'm taking. He gets to keep enough to live well. He just stops being what he is. She thought about Vincent moving through the dark toward a property in New Jersey, 7 men, a plan that Blackwell said wouldn't work. She thought about Marco Reyes's daughter, 8 years old. She thought about the window of the library and the taillights disappearing into the trees. "And if I don't call him," she said. A pause, the first one that had any weight in it. "Then what happens next gets considerably messier. Not a threat delivered with heat, just information, which was worse." She sat in the windowless room in the old chair with the weak light and the decades of paperback thrillers, and she thought very carefully for approximately 4 seconds. "My husband doesn't stand down," she said. "Not for me. Not for anyone. You spent 2 years studying him and you don't know that? He stood down from 3 strategic positions last year to ensure your safety at public events." She hadn't known that. She absorbed it without showing that she hadn't known it. "Good night, Richard," she said, and ended the call. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that and pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed until they stopped. Then she went to find the security man and said, "I need to reach Vincent right now." The number Leo had given her for operational contact rang once, and was picked up by someone who wasn't Vincent, a man who said his name was Reese and identified himself as communications, and she said, "Blackwell just called me on my personal cell. He knows Vincent's en route. I need Vincent to know that." A silence. Then, "Hold." She held. 40 seconds that felt like considerably more, and then Vincent's voice, compressed slightly by the line, the background carrying distant sounds she couldn't identify. "You answered. He called me. He knows you're coming. He says the plan won't work and he wants me to call you off. He's trying to see. I know what he's trying to do. I told him no and I hung up." She kept her voice even. "I'm telling you because you need to know he's tracking you and he's not rattled. He called me from a position of complete confidence." A pause. She heard Vincent breathe once. "He's confident because he thinks the 3 people who turned are the extent of my loss. He doesn't know about Carver." "Who's Carver?" "Someone who turned back." His voice was very low now, close to the phone. "Claire, stay in the interior room. Don't open the door for anyone I know." She paused. "Vincent, is my father actually okay?" A beat. 2. "We're 4 minutes out. I'll know in 4 minutes." "Okay," she said. "Don't call this line again unless the perimeter alarm triggers. Reese will contact you when—" She heard it then. Not through the phone. Through the wall. A sound from somewhere on the property, muffled by the old construction of the house, but present. Not the wind. Purposeful. "Vincent?" she said quietly. "Something just—" The lights went out, complete dark. The lamp, the hallway light visible under the door, everything. The phone screen was the only light, and she pressed herself back in the chair and heard Vincent's voice from it, sharp. "Claire." The power just went out. "Get on the floor, right now. Get on the floor and stay there." She went off the chair and onto the floor, phone pressed to her ear, back against the wall beside the chair rather than behind it. The carpet smelled like dust and old wood. She could hear her own breathing and tried to slow it. From somewhere in the house, above her, she thought, the 2nd floor. She heard a sound that might have been footsteps, or might have been the house settling, and she lay there on the floor in the dark and couldn't tell the difference. "The interior security," she whispered. "They've been alerted. Stay quiet. Stay down." His voice had gone to the operational register completely now. No texture to it, just instruction. "We're redirecting. 3 minutes." 3 minutes was a long time. She lay on the floor and listened to the house and heard nothing. Then something. Then nothing again. The phone screen dimmed to save power, and she let it dim because the light was worse than the dark right now. Her heart was doing something loud and insistent, and she focused on her breathing and on the specific geography of the room. Door ahead of her, bookshelf to her left, the 2 chairs, no other exits. Then she heard the sitting room door handle move. Not thrown open, tested, carefully, the way a person tests a door when they don't want to make noise and don't know what's on the other side. She stopped breathing entirely. The handle moved again, and then the door opened, slow, and she pressed herself into the corner beside the bookshelf, with the phone face down against her chest to kill the screen light. And she heard footsteps come into the room, one person, moving carefully. A flashlight beam crossed the wall, crossed the 2 chairs. moved toward the bookshelf. She threw the chair. Not at the person. She grabbed the nearest chair by its arm and shoved it sideways into the path of the flashlight, and the person stumbled, and she was already moving, staying low, going for the door, and she heard the person recover and heard her own heartbeat louder than anything and made it to the hallway and ran. The hallway was dark, but she knew the layout. She'd walked it enough times in the past 24 hours that her body remembered without needing to see. She went left, toward the main staircase, away from the kitchen, and heard the footsteps behind her, and they were faster than she'd hoped. She hit the staircase and went up, which was wrong strategically, and she knew it, but down was where the person behind her expected her to go. And she reached the second-floor landing and heard the commotion below. Not just one person now, more. The sounds of the interior security team engaging with something. Voices, one sharp sound that might have been a door or might have been something worse. She went into the first room on the second floor, her room, where she'd unpacked her dresses with methodical hands only hours ago, and locked the door and put her back against it and pressed the phone screen on and called the operational line. "Someone is in the house," she said when Reese picked up. "Second floor, my room, door locked. Someone came in through the ground floor. I don't know about the security team." "Mrs. Callahan, we're—" A burst of noise on his end. 60 seconds. She looked at the door. The handle didn't move. She looked at the window. East-facing, second floor, 12 feet to the ground. She'd noted the drop 2 days ago with the automatic part of her brain that had learned to catalog exits in the 18 months of living with a man who never entered a room without knowing how to leave it. The door handle moved. Not testing this time. Turning. The lock held, and then she heard the sound of something applied to the other side of it, and she knew what that meant. She went to the window, opened it. Cold air poured in. The October night. The smell of wet leaves and mud from earlier rain. She looked down. 12 feet. Grass below. One of the perimeter security lights at the corner of the building throwing pale light across the side yard. The door lock gave. She went out the window. Not gracefully. She got her legs over the sill and dropped, and the 12 feet was longer than she'd calculated it in her head. And she hit the grass and her right ankle turned under her, and she went down hard on her hands and knees and stayed down for a second, breathing, and heard the window above her and rolled sideways behind the foundation planting along the building's edge. She lay in the cold, wet grass with her hands bleeding from the gravel edge of the flower bed, and her ankles sending sharp information up her leg, and she pressed herself flat and looked up and saw the window above her and the shape of someone at it, flashlight scanning the grounds. The light swept past her twice. The planting covered her well enough. She was in shadow, face down, the dark coat she'd put on before bed, doing what it was supposed to do. And after the second sweep, the light moved away. She waited 15 seconds, then got up, putting weight carefully on the ankle, usable, barely, and moved along the building's edge toward the front of the property. She heard the cars before she saw them. 2 sets of headlights coming fast up the private road, and she pressed herself against the building wall and waited because fast headlights at 3 in the morning could be several things. Then she heard Vincent's voice, not on a phone, actual and present, and about 40 yards away, barking a name she didn't recognize, and she stepped out from the building wall and said, "Here." The flashlight found her, and she put her hand up against it and heard footsteps running toward her, and then Vincent was in front of her, both hands on her face, tilting it up to look at her in the flashlight's backwash, his eyes moving over her fast, assessing, cataloging, the same rapid calculation she'd seen him apply to rooms full of people now applied entirely to her face. "I'm fine," she said. "My hands, my ankle. I'm fine." He exhaled. One exhale, hard, the release of something that had been held at considerable pressure, and then his hands came off her face, and he was already turning, already talking into his earpiece, already managing the next thing. But she'd felt it, the 2 seconds of his hands on her face and the exhale, and she held on to those like something solid in the dark. "The house is compromised," he said to her, still moving. "We had 3 of Blackwell's people come in through the service entrance. The security rotation had been fed false timing. We're clearing it now." He looked at her ankle. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Stay behind me. 6 feet. Don't stop for anything." They were at the New Jersey property by 5:15. She hadn't planned to be there. She'd planned, as Vincent had put it, to be a non-variable. But the estate was compromised and there was no clean secondary location, and the operational logic of keeping her stationary had collapsed when Blackwell demonstrated he knew exactly where stationary was. And so she was in the second car of a four-vehicle convoy, moving through the pre-dawn dark of the New Jersey Turnpike, with her hands wrapped in a first-aid bandage and her ankle braced by an elastic wrap that someone had produced from a kit in the car's emergency panel. Vincent was in the first car. She knew because she could see it through the windshield of hers, and she spent the 40-minute drive watching it the way she'd watched taillights disappear into the trees earlier, except this time she could maintain the visual. Reese, the communications man, 40s, a face that had clearly been broken and reset at least once, was beside her. "We have a live feed from an asset inside the building," he told her, not because she'd asked, but because he'd apparently decided she'd earned operational information by going out a second-story window. He tilted a tablet so she could see the screen. Grainy, thermal camera quality, a floor plan's worth of heat signatures. "Your father is in the northeast corner of the ground floor, one guard. Blackwell is in the building, but we don't have his precise location." "Vincent knows." "Yes." She looked at the thermal shapes. One of them, in the northeast corner, smaller than the others, stationary, seated, the particular stillness of someone who had been told to stay in a chair and didn't see the value in doing otherwise. She was almost certain that was her father, Thomas Whitmore, who had used her, who had called every Sunday and kept her mother's photo on his desk and loved her in all the ways he was capable of loving anything, which had turned out to be insufficient ways, conditional ways, ways that bent under pressure. She looked at the heat signature in the northeast corner and felt the contradiction of loving someone you were also furious at, and knew it was going to live in her for a long time after tonight. The convoy stopped a quarter-mile from the target property. She watched the first car through her windshield and saw Vincent get out, and there was a brief assembly of people she could only partially see in the pre-dawn dark, and then the group moved, and the pre-dawn dark took them. Reese said, "We wait here." "I know," she said. The wait was 22 minutes. She counted them. She had nothing else to do. Reese monitored the tablet and spoke occasionally into a headset in language she'd stopped trying to follow, and she sat in the back seat of the car and counted minutes and watched the dark property through the window. She heard it before she saw anything, a sound from the direction of the building, more than one sound, brief and contained. Then nothing for 3 minutes. Then voices on Reese's headset, and Reese's posture changing in the particular way that meant information had arrived. She said, "Is he—" "Your father is secured," Reese said. "He's out of the building," she exhaled. "And Vincent." Reese listened to something. His face was doing something careful. "Mr. Callahan is still inside." She looked at the building. "Why?" Reese said nothing, which was its own answer. "Reese?" Her voice had an edge in it that surprised even her. "Why is he still inside?" "Blackwell didn't run," Reese said carefully. "He stayed to negotiate." Negotiate! She heard the word and felt it land wrong. Blackwell is in there negotiating with Vincent right now. "We believe that's the situation, yes." She thought about Blackwell on the phone 3 hours ago, smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man operating from a position of complete confidence. She thought about the word demonstrate. She thought about 2 years of building a coalition and 3 people turned inside Vincent's organization and Marco Reyes's daughter, 8 years old, and the way Blackwell had said your husband made a mistake, he let it become real. She thought about a man who had spent 2 years learning every pressure point available, who had her father as a failed piece of leverage and Vincent alone in a building now, and she thought, he didn't stay to negotiate. He stayed because he still thinks he has something that works. "I need to go in," she said. "Mrs. Callahan, Blackwell's play is Vincent," she said. "Everything. The coalition, your father, the compromised estate, tonight. It's all been to get Vincent alone in a room where the choice is surrender or She stopped. "He's not negotiating. He's making his final demand, and the demand is going to be about me." Reese looked at her. She could see him calculating, the same kind of calculating she'd watched Vincent do in the dining room 2 nights ago, except Reese was faster to show it on his face. "You don't know that," he said. "No," she said, "but I know enough." She opened the car door. Inside the building, in a room she hadn't seen yet, her husband was standing across from the man who had spent 2 years building toward this exact moment. And she understood with the particular clarity that comes at 5 in the morning after a night like this one, that Vincent would give up every piece of what he'd built before he let anyone use her as leverage again. And Richard Blackwell, who had studied Vincent Callahan for 2 years, absolutely knew that. Which meant the thing Blackwell was holding wasn't her father anymore. It was the offer. Walk away from everything. The empire, the territories, the organization. And Claire stays safe. Stay and fight. And the next thing Blackwell demonstrates won't be as clean as Marco Reyes. She knew this the way she knew it was cold outside and her ankle hurt and her hands were bandaged. Not because she'd been told. Because she had spent 18 months learning to read a situation by watching a man who never explained himself, and that education had been worth something after all. She walked toward the building in the pre-dawn dark, Reese 3 steps behind her, saying her name in the voice of a man who knew he wasn't going to stop her. The frost-hard ground crunching under her feet, her wrapped ankle sending its steady complaint up her leg, and she thought, every person in this situation has made decisions about my life without asking me. Her father, Vincent. Blackwell, in his way. She was done being the variable that other people accounted for. The building's side door was the one Vincent's team had used. She could tell by the way it sat slightly ajar in its frame, and she pushed it open and went in. The interior was dark except for 2 emergency lights at floor level, the kind that kick on when main power fails, throwing everything into a low red-tinged shadow that made distances hard to read. She could hear voices from deeper in the building. One of them was Vincent's, she was certain, though she couldn't make out words. The other was smoother, unhurried. She moved toward the voices. Her ankle was getting worse, but she moved toward the voices. The hallway opened into a large central room. Industrial, a former warehouse space fitted out minimally. Concrete floor, exposed ceiling, the kind of space that existed in this part of New Jersey in large supply. There were crates along one wall. 2 of Blackwell's men at the far end, positioned deliberately. One of Vincent's people near the entrance, who saw her come in and moved toward her with an expression that said, "You are absolutely not supposed to be here," before she stopped him with a look that she'd apparently learned from watching her husband long enough. At the center of the room, facing each other across about 15 feet of concrete floor. Vincent. Jacket gone, shirt untucked on one side where it had pulled loose. She could see he'd been in something physical before this moment. There was a cut along his jaw that was still tracking blood. His hands were at his sides. His face was the locked version, the public version, the one she'd spent 18 months trying to read through. And Richard Blackwell, suit still immaculate, because of course it was. Silver-haired and utterly composed, the kind of composed that came from knowing you held the last card. She saw the moment Vincent registered her presence. His eyes moved from Blackwell's face to a point behind Blackwell's shoulder, the place where she'd appeared in his peripheral vision, and for one fraction of a second his locked expression broke. Blackwell saw it. Of course he saw it. He'd been watching Vincent's face for exactly that. He turned, and when he saw her standing there, something in his expression shifted too. Not surprise exactly. More like a man watching his most accurate prediction come true. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Vincent's voice, very quiet and very specific, came across 15 feet of concrete. "Claire, go back outside." She looked at her husband's face, the cut along his jaw, the controlled fury underneath the locked expression, the thing she'd learned in 18 months to read as fear presenting itself as anger. And she looked at Richard Blackwell, unhurried and silver-haired, holding the last card. "No," she said. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "No." Blackwell looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. Not thrown, not rattled, but updating, the way a chess player updates when an unexpected piece enters the board. His head tilted slightly. The composed silver hair, the immaculate suit, the unhurried bearing that she'd found charming for 12 minutes at a gala and now read completely differently. He was studying her the way he'd studied her at the gala, the same focused attention, and she let him look because she had nothing to hide from his looking. Vincent said her name again. Not a command this time. Something rawer than that. She didn't look at him yet. She kept her eyes on Blackwell. "You've been building toward this for 2 years, she said. I want to know what you actually want." Blackwell smiled. It was a real smile. That was the thing about him. His smiles were always real, which made them harder to dismiss. "Your husband knows what I want." "He does," she said, "and I know too." You want him to walk away, give up the territories, the organization, the infrastructure he spent 20 years building. In exchange, I stay safe. My father goes home. She paused. That's the offer. That's a version of it. What's the rest? Blackwell looked past her at Vincent. You want to tell her, or should I? She heard Vincent move 2 steps, coming to stand beside her rather than behind her, which she registered as significant. His shoulder was 4 inches from hers. She could feel the heat coming off him and see the cut along his jaw in her peripheral vision, the dried blood tracking down toward his chin. She still didn't look at him. Not yet. He has a federal contact, Vincent said. His voice was even, controlled. Someone in the Bureau who's been building the case against the organization for 3 years. Blackwell has been feeding them material, selectively. Enough to indict, not enough to have moved yet. A pause. The offer is, I walk away completely, he pulls the material, the case stalls without his cooperation. I disappear from the criminal world on my own terms, instead of in handcuffs. And if you don't, the material goes to the Bureau Monday morning, enough for a federal indictment by end of week. He said it the same way he said everything factual, without inflection. I'd likely be looking at 20 years minimum. She absorbed that. The whole room was very quiet. Blackwell's 2 men at the far wall, Vincent's man near the entrance, Reese somewhere behind her, everyone very still in the way that people go still when the central thing is happening and moving would disturb it. 20 years. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. She was 31. She looked at Blackwell. You've had this material for how long? Long enough, he said pleasantly. And you held it. You could have submitted it at any point and destroyed the organization without any of this. She gestured slightly. The warehouse, the night, the months of preparation. Why the theater? Blackwell's smile changed quality. Because destroying the organization wasn't the point, Mrs. Callahan. Inheriting it was. He said it simply, the way a man says the most honest thing he's said all night, because he knows the honesty doesn't hurt him anymore. An organization built on fear is only as stable as its leadership. I don't want to burn what Vincent built. I want to run it. And to run it, I need him gone voluntarily, not arrested, because an arrested boss creates chaos, loyalty fractures, territories go to war. But a boss who walks away cleanly? He opened one hand, a gesture of elegant simplicity. The infrastructure stays intact. His people absorb into the new order. Everyone gets to keep eating. And you get the empire, she said. I've earned it, honestly. He said the word honestly without any apparent irony. 2 years of work, more patience than most people are capable of. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the gala, the Monet conversation, the hand on hers, all of it engineered and studied and deployed with the precision of someone who treated people as mechanisms to be operated. She thought about Marco Reyes, 11 years with the organization, a daughter in 2nd grade. She thought about the men who had turned, people Vincent had trusted, pressured, or bought, or both. And she thought about her father sitting in the northeast corner with the television on, a man who had adapted quickly to the circumstances because Thomas Whitmore had spent his whole life adapting to circumstances of his own making. You're not going to get it, she said. Blackwell looked at her with something that was almost genuine curiosity. And why is that? Because you made the same mistake my husband made, she said. You studied him and you found the weakness and you built everything around it. But the weakness isn't me. She held his gaze. The weakness was the distance, the not knowing. The 18 months of him managing information and me moving through it blind. She felt rather than saw Vincent go very still beside her. You needed that distance to exist. You needed me to be the unknown variable, the pressure point he couldn't calculate because he'd never told me the truth. That's what you exploited at the gala. That's what the whole plan ran on. Blackwell said nothing. He was listening, which told her she was right. The distance is gone, she said. I know everything now. He told me. All of it. My father, the debts, the 14 months, the federal case, the turned associates, all of it. She felt the weight of the last 24 hours in her body. The floor of the windowless room, the window she'd gone out of, the frost-hard ground, the pre-dawn drive, and she let that weight be present in her voice without performing it. You needed me to be the thing he was protecting from the truth. I'm not that anymore. And without that, without the gap between us, you don't have the leverage you think you have. The room breathed. Blackwell looked at her, then at Vincent. His composure was intact. She'd expected it to be. He wasn't a man who showed cracks easily. But something behind the composure had shifted. She could see it in the slight adjustment of his weight, the almost imperceptible change in the set of his jaw. She had spent 18 months learning to read the almost imperceptible changes in a man who didn't show anything, and that education was worth something. "The federal material doesn't change," he said, still smooth. Still unhurried, though she noted the unhurried quality required slightly more maintenance now. "Whatever the state of your marriage, the indictment is the indictment." "Yes," she said, "it is." She looked at Vincent then. For the first time since she'd walked into this room, she turned fully and looked at her husband's face. He was looking at her with the expression she'd seen in the elevator hallway, in the sitting room, in the borrowed room at the estate. The almost movement. The thing that would be a feeling if he let it surface. Except right now, in this light, with the blood drying on his jaw and 2 years of Blackwell's architecture crumbling around them, it had surfaced. She could see it fully and plainly, the way you can only see something when the conditions are finally right. He was terrified, and he was not trying to hide it from her. "Walk away," she said to him. Quietly. Just to him, though everyone in the room could hear. From the organization, from the territories, from all of it. His jaw tightened. "Not because he's forcing you," she said. "Because it's the right choice. Because you've known for a long time that it was the right choice, and you've been protecting the wrong things." She held his gaze. "Walk away on your own terms tonight, and it means something. Let them indict you, and it means something different." "Claire, I'm not asking you to surrender to him," she said. "I'm asking you to stop surrendering to this." She meant the organization, the empire, the thing he'd built at the cost of everything else. And she watched him understand what she meant, and watched the understanding move through him. Vincent looked at Blackwell. Something passed across his face that she couldn't fully read. Complicated, old, the expression of a man looking at the thing he'd spent his life building and seeing it accurately, maybe for the first time. Then he looked back at her, and he nodded. Once. Small, barely perceptible. She released a breath she'd been holding since she walked through the door. "I want my father in the next 5 minutes," she said to Blackwell, "and I want the federal material withdrawn." Blackwell studied her. "You're not in a position to make demands." "I'm in the only position that matters," she said. "You needed an unwilling Vincent Callahan backed into a corner. That's what your whole plan required. A man with no other options. You don't have that." She held his gaze. "You have a man making a choice. Which means whatever deal you make tonight has to be a real deal. Not a surrender. An agreement." She paused. "My father. The material. And you keep the territories through a structured transition that his lawyers document and witness, so there's no question about the terms." She paused again. "Or we walk out of here tonight. He fights the indictment with the best legal team money can afford, and you spend the next 3 years in federal court instead of running an empire. Your choice." The warehouse was very quiet. Blackwell looked at her for a long time. She met it without flinching, which cost her more than she let show. Her ankle was actively painful now. Her hands throbbed under the bandages, and she was running on something that wasn't quite adrenaline anymore, something past that, something that was mostly just will. Then Blackwell smiled. It was a different smile from the others, smaller, more genuine, the smile of a man who had encountered something he hadn't anticipated and was capable of appreciating it even at cost to himself. "Your wife," he said to Vincent, "is considerably more dangerous than your file on her suggested." Vincent said very quietly, "I know." They had her father out in 6 minutes. He came through a side door escorted by one of Blackwell's men, moving under his own power, which she'd been told and still needed to see with her eyes to believe. He was wearing his overcoat over what looked like yesterday's clothes, and his hair was disheveled, and he looked smaller than she remembered him being. Or maybe she was seeing him differently now, through information she hadn't had the last time she'd looked at him. When he saw her, his face did something complicated and immediate that she wasn't ready for. His eyes went wet. He crossed toward her with his hands out, and she held still and let him reach her, and he gripped both her hands. She winced at the right one, the bandaged palm, and he looked down at it, and his face did another complicated thing. "Claire," he said. His voice was wrecked. Not here," she said, quiet. Not tonight, but we're going to talk. He nodded. He kept nodding, too many times, the way people do when they're trying to communicate something they don't have words for yet. She squeezed his hands once, the left one, and then released them. The transition logistics took another 40 minutes. Lawyers were called, on both sides, at 4 in the morning, because these were lawyers who were paid specifically to answer at 4 in the morning. Documentation was discussed in language she mostly followed and occasionally didn't, and Vincent spoke in the measured operational voice throughout, and Blackwell matched it, and the two of them worked through the terms with the particular detached efficiency of professionals conducting business, which was what it was. She sat on a crate near the wall with her ankle elevated on another crate and watched her husband dismantle the empire he'd spent 20 years building in real time, in legal language, in a New Jersey warehouse at 4:30 in the morning. She watched his face while he did it and saw nothing dramatic there. No grief, no rage, no visible sense of loss. What she saw instead was the face of a man doing something he'd already decided to do, and the decision being the hard part, not the execution. She understood that. The deciding was always the hard part. At 5:47, the documentation was complete enough for the night. Final terms would require several weeks of legal work, and she understood that. And she also understood that what had happened tonight was the thing that made the legal work possible. A line crossed, a point of no return reached and passed, a commitment made in a room full of witnesses that couldn't be unmade. Vincent's man drove her father to a hotel. Before he left, Thomas Whitmore stood in front of her for a long moment with his hands at his sides, not reaching for her this time, just standing. "I know what I did," he said. "I know that saying I was desperate doesn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I know it doesn't cover it." She looked at her father. 70 years old, a bad knee, first edition mystery novels, Sunday phone calls. A man who loved her in the ways he was capable of loving, which had bent under pressure and broken things she was still cataloging. "No," she said. "It doesn't." "I'm sorry, Claire." She held his gaze. She thought about what she'd told Vincent in the sitting room at the estate, what felt like a week ago but was less than 12 hours. Protecting someone by controlling their choices is not love. It's another kind of prison. She thought about which of the men in her life had done that to her and how they'd each justified it and how the justifications were all different and the effect was the same. "I know you are," she said. "That's real. I know it's real." She paused. "It's going to take me time to figure out what I do with it." He nodded. His eyes were still wet, but he held himself together, which was something, and she thought, he's trying. He's been terrible at many things, but he's trying right now, in this parking lot, and I can hold both of those things simultaneously without letting either one cancel the other out. She didn't hug him. She wasn't ready for that yet. But she stood there until the car door closed and watched the taillights go and let herself feel the full, complicated weight of it without performing any particular response. The drive back was just the two of them in the back of one car, Reese up front with the driver, the sky beginning to go gray in the east, in the specific way that means dawn is coming but hasn't arrived yet. Vincent sat beside her, not on his side of the seat, beside her, the actual middle of the seat, closer than he'd ever voluntarily positioned himself in any car they'd shared. His arm was against hers. She didn't know if he'd done it consciously. She didn't move away. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The turnpike went past the windows, the gray highway, and the gray sky, and the occasional headlights of other people driving through the end of the night for reasons she'd never know. "The federal case," she said finally, "even with Blackwell pulling his cooperation, there's other material." "Some," he said. "My lawyers have been managing the exposure for 3 years. Without Blackwell's cooperation, the case is significantly weaker." A pause. "It's not nothing. We'll be in legal processes for a while." "We," she said. He looked at her. "If you stay." He said it with the same directness he'd applied to everything tonight, the same willingness to deliver facts without softening. "I'm not assuming. I haven't assumed anything since—" He stopped. "Since 3 weeks in, when I understood you didn't know what you'd married." She looked at the gray highway. "You thought about telling me. Back then." "Yes." "What stopped you?" "At first, exposure, operational risk." He held her gaze when she turned to look at him. "After that, it was different. After about 6 months, I understood that telling you would mean you'd leave. That the only reason you were still there was because you didn't have the full picture. His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath the level, the thing that cost him. And I didn't want you to leave. She sat with that. You kept me ignorant so I'd stay. Yes. Vincent, that's exactly what my father did. I know, he said. I've known for a while. He looked at his hands. First time she'd seen him look at his hands, rather than at a room or a problem or her face. It didn't stop me. What changed? You. Simple. Flat. Watching you at the gala. Watching you light up talking to someone who looked at you, and knowing that I had caused every minute of the distance between us. That I had constructed it deliberately. He paused. The jealousy was real. It was embarrassing and real, and I didn't know what to do with it, but underneath it was something worse. He looked at her. I was ashamed of what I'd built. Not the organization, the 18 months, the management, the way I'd treated you like a variable. She felt the words land in the specific places where things had been hurt, felt them land and stayed with the feeling rather than deflecting it. You could have kept going, she said. Tonight, before I walked in, you were considering taking his deal. I was considering all options, he said carefully. Vincent. A pause. Yes, I was considering it. Because he threatened me. Because threatening you works, he said, and I'd rather give up everything I've built than spend one day knowing you were in danger because of me. He said it without drama, the same voice he used to convey operational facts, and that was what made it land hardest. That's not a position of strength. I'm aware of that. She looked at him. The cut along his jaw, dried now, the exhaustion that had settled into his face in the last hour, the dark circles, the shirt still untucked on one side. She looked at the face she'd been trying to read for 18 months through walls of silence and management and careful distance, and found it readable now, clear, tired, open in the way that things become open when there's nothing left to protect. It's not weakness, she said. Caring about someone isn't weakness. In my experience, your experience is very specific and very damaged, she said, not unkindly. You built an entire empire on the assumption that feeling anything was a liability, and you were operating in a world where that was partially true. But you're not just in that world. She held his gaze. You're also in a car with me at 5 in the morning, and in this car the calculus is different. He looked at her for a long moment. The gray dawn was filling the windows slowly, the first actual light, and in it she could see his face better than she'd been able to in the warehouse. And it was... She held the observation carefully. It was the face of someone learning, in real time, that a thing they'd believed for their entire adult life was not entirely true. I don't know how to do this, he said. The admission was quiet and cost him visibly. I know how to run operations. I know how to manage threats. I know how to make people afraid of me and how to use that. He paused. I don't know how to... He stopped again. Be a person, she said. Yes. She thought about that. She thought about a boy who had lost his family young and learned that the only reliable protection was fear, and had built an empire on that lesson, and had been right enough times that the lesson had calcified into something he'd never questioned. She thought about the flowers someone had put in the estate's main room, the small human gesture in the tactical environment, and she thought, he told Donna to do that. I'm almost certain he told Donna to do that. The flowers at the estate, she said. He looked at her. What? Someone put fresh flowers in the main room when we arrived. It was a very small thing, very out of place with everything else. She watched his face. Was that you? The fractional pause, the almost movement. Donna handles the domestic. Was it you? He looked out the window. I told her the room was sparse. She felt something shift in her chest that had been resistant to shifting for a long time. You told her to make it less like a safe house and more like somewhere a person might feel. I wanted you to feel like it wasn't a facility, he said, to the window, still not looking at her. You'd already had the penthouse and the security details and the Leo memos. I thought, he stopped. I thought one room that didn't look like a tactical asset was the least I could do. She looked at the side of his face, the jaw, the dried blood, the dark eye catching the growing gray light. She thought about 18 months of flowers never given, and meals arranged through staff and cars brought around in the rain, and every small invisible thing he had done that she hadn't known to read as what it was. "Vincent," she said. He turned from the window. "I'm not leaving," she said. He held very still, the kind of still that was the opposite of the controlled tactical stillness she'd catalogued. This was the stillness of a person who has heard something and needs a moment before they trust it. "The marriage we had for 18 months is over," she said. "That particular arrangement, the distance, the management, the information control, the strategic silence, that's done. I'm not going back to that." She held his gaze steadily. "But I'm not leaving." "Claire, let me finish." She shifted to face him more fully, ignoring the complaint from her ankle. "You're going to have to learn things, basic things that most people learn earlier. How to say what you mean without it being an operational decision. How to ask for something instead of engineering the circumstances so you don't have to ask. How to let someone be angry with you and not manage the anger." She paused. "I'm going to be angry with you for a while. About the 14 months. About my father and what you knew and when. That's not going to be comfortable for either of us." "I know," he said. "And I'm going to need you to stop treating me like a variable," she said. "In any context. I need to be the person you talk to, not the person you account for." "Yes. That's going to be hard for you." "Yes," he said again. She looked at him. "But you're going to try." He held her gaze, and for once there was no locked expression, no professional register, no almost movement, just his face and the gray dawn light, and the specific quality of a man making a commitment he understands the cost of. "Yes," he said, "I'm going to try." She nodded. She turned back to face forward. After a moment, his arm pressed against hers again, and she didn't move away, and they rode the rest of the way into the gray morning without speaking, and it was the most honest silence they'd ever shared. The weeks that followed were not quiet. The legal work was extensive and grinding and required more of Vincent's time than either of them had anticipated, though she understood later that he'd known exactly how extensive it would be and hadn't told her, and then caught himself not telling her and called her from the lawyer's office to explain the situation himself, which she recognized as the effortful version of growth and credited accordingly. The federal exposure was real. 2 of his lawyers were excellent and 1 was extraordinary, and the case without Blackwell's cooperation was significantly weakened but not eliminated, and there were 6 months of proceedings that she didn't fully understand and wasn't always briefed on, but was never actively excluded from. The distinction mattered. She kept the foundation work. She'd expected to lose that, expected that the unwinding of the Callahan organization's public infrastructure would take the foundation with it. But her work there was genuine and documented, and the board wanted to keep her, and she discovered that she'd built something real there independent of what her name had opened for her. That discovery was more important than she'd known to expect it to be. She talked to her father on a Tuesday in November, 3 weeks after the warehouse, at a diner in Midtown that neither of them had associations with. He was thinner. She was quieter than usual. They sat across from each other and drank coffee, and he told her the full version, the gambling, the accumulation, the 3 organizations, the moment he decided to use her as the solution. And he told it without softening it, which was the hardest thing she'd watched him do. She didn't interrupt. She let him say all of it. When he finished, they were quiet for a while. "I need to understand something," she said. "The Sunday calls. Every Sunday, my whole adult life, the photo of Mom on the desk." She looked at him. "Was any of it?" "All of it," he said immediately. "Claire, all of it was real. I love you. That's never been... The debt and the decision I made, those were about my failure, my weakness, the worst version of me." His voice broke slightly, and he steadied it. "My love for you was never the transaction." She looked at him across the diner table. She was thinking about what it meant to love someone imperfectly, to love them genuinely and still use them, still make choices that treated them as a means to an end, and to hold those 2 things simultaneously in one person. She was thinking about how that wasn't unique to her father. She was thinking about Vincent and the flowers, and the 14 months and the sitting room at the estate, and the moment in the warehouse when he'd nearly taken the deal. "I know," she said. "I know it was real." She paused. "It doesn't mean what you did was okay." "No. But it means we can figure out what comes next." She looked at him steadily. "That's what I'm offering. Not absolution. Just figuring out what comes next. He nodded. His eyes were wet again. She thought about how she'd spent her whole life being moved by her father's emotion, reading it as proof of his love, and how she was reading it differently now, not doubting it, but contextualing it, understanding that genuine feeling and genuinely bad choices could coexist in the same person, and that the feeling didn't excuse the choices even though the choices didn't erase the feeling. That was a more complicated thing to carry than either simple forgiveness or simple fury. But it was the true thing, and she'd decided she'd rather carry the true thing than the easier version. They had dinner. Her father ordered the chicken soup and ate most of it. She had coffee and a slice of pie she didn't finish. They talked about things that were not the warehouse, not the gala, not the $4 million. They talked about a book he'd read, a foundation project she was developing, the way winter was arriving early this year. It was a thin conversation laid over a very heavy one, and it was okay. It was a beginning. She and Vincent left New York in February. Not secretly. Not in the manufactured disappearance way that his former life had required. They rented a house, a normal transaction, names on a lease, no security team, no Leo, no Marcus, in a town on the Maine coast that had approximately 4,000 people and a harbor that froze in deep winter and thawed in March, in a way that the locals talked about like it was a significant annual event. The house was old and needed work. She'd picked it partly for that reason, the way a project requires presence, requires actual physical engagement rather than management from a distance. She thought that was probably good for both of them. Vincent was bad at idleness. She'd expected that, and it was worse than expected. He woke early and was restless until he had something concrete to do, and for the first several weeks the something concrete was the house, fixing the back porch railing, repointing the mortar on the fireplace, learning from a YouTube tutorial how to replace a water heater, which he did incorrectly the first time and correctly the second time without being visibly bothered by having been wrong, which was its own kind of growth. She wrote. She'd started writing, essays mostly, nothing for publication yet, just her own thinking about art and attention and what it meant to look at something carefully. She had her Columbia degree and 18 months of museum board work and years of careful observation in rooms full of powerful people, and she was finding that it all had something to say if she gave it space to say it. They ate dinner together, every night, sometimes in silence, which was different from the penthouse silence, not pressurized, not managed, just the comfortable quiet of two people who had run out of need to perform. Sometimes they talked about the house or the town or a piece she was working on, and occasionally about harder things, because there were still harder things to work through and they had agreed not to road around them. In March, she confronted him about something she'd been carrying since November, a specific piece of the 14 months, a specific decision he'd made about her foundation access that she'd found documentation of in the legal materials, a moment where he'd arranged for her to receive less information than the board had actually voted to give her, routed through a contact of his. She'd sat on it for 4 months, working out whether it was the thing she thought it was before she brought it. She brought it on a Thursday over the dishes. He didn't deny it. He explained the operational reasoning, and she listened to the reasoning and told him why the reasoning was a problem, and he listened to that, the whole thing, without interrupting or redirecting, which was different from how he would have handled it in October. Not completely different, but different enough to notice. They were angry for 2 days. Real anger, not managed, not routed through Leo or resolved by one of them retreating behind a closed door. She said things that were specific and fair and cost her to say. He said things that were less graceful but more honest than she'd expected. On the second day, he apologized for that specific decision in a way that was concrete rather than general, naming what he'd done, naming why it was wrong, not asking her to move past it before she was ready. She didn't say it was okay because it wasn't okay. She said she heard him. That was what she had. It was enough. The second wedding was not a wedding. She'd been clear about that. Not a ceremony, not an event, not a thing that required guests or documentation or photography or any of the infrastructure that their first marriage had been built on. What she wanted, what she'd said she wanted when he'd asked her, in February, in the rental house kitchen, the first time he'd asked her anything about their future with no tactical preface, was a day. Just a day. Their choice. Their terms. They drove to the coast on a Saturday in late April, when the harbor had been thawed for 3 weeks, and the light over the water was doing the particular thing it does in coastal Maine when winter has finally, genuinely released, flat and brilliant and clean, in a way that feels like the first day of something. They walked out on the rocks at the edge of the town's small public beach, the two of them, and the wind was cold and they were both underdressed for it, and at some point they stopped walking and stood looking at the water. He took her hand. Not a grand gesture, just his hand finding hers, the fingers closing around her fingers, the particular warmth of it in the cold air. She looked at their hands and thought about the first time she'd noticed his hands, at the gala 14 months ago, how she'd clocked them the way she clocked everything about him. Neutral observation, part of the ongoing study of a man she lived with but didn't know. She wasn't doing neutral observation anymore. She was doing something messier and less protected and considerably more real. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. "I spent my whole life building things I could control," he said. I was looking at the water. Organizations, systems, loyalties. I understood the architecture of all of it. What made it stable? What made it fragile? How to maintain it? I was good at it. He paused. "You are the only thing I've ever encountered that I couldn't make a system for. And I tried." He glanced at her. "I tried for 18 months, and every system I built fell apart because you were always doing things I hadn't accounted for." "Like what?" she said. "Like going out a second-story window." The corner of his mouth moved. "Like walking into a warehouse at 5 in the morning. Like..." He paused. "Like forgiving me on a timeline I didn't deserve." "I haven't forgiven you," she said. "I'm still working on that." "I know." His hand tightened slightly on hers. "That's what I mean. You're honest about where things actually are. You don't tell me things are resolved when they aren't." He looked back at the water. "I have never in my life been with anyone who was more honest with me than they were comfortable being. It's unsettling. I mean that as a compliment." She laughed. It came out genuine and slightly surprised, and she felt his hand change around hers in response to it. Not tightening, something more like relaxing, like the laugh had done something to the tension he was carrying. "I want to say something too," she said. "Okay." She looked at the water. The light was doing that brilliant, clean thing, and the harbor was dark blue and flat, and somewhere behind them the town was going about its Saturday business with total indifference to the two people on the rocks. "I came into this marriage angry," she said, "and then I came into it resigned. And then for a while I thought I'd settled into a kind of managed acceptance, the thing where you've adjusted your expectations so thoroughly that you stop feeling the gap between what you wanted and what you have." She paused. "I was wrong about that. I hadn't adjusted. I just stopped looking at the gap directly. Claire, I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true, and you asked me once to be honest, even when it was uncomfortable." She glanced at him. "This is what that looks like. There was a gap. I wasn't looking at it." She turned back to the water. "And then you told me the truth. All of it. In that room at the estate, even knowing what it would cost you. And I started looking at the gap, and it was still there, but it was a different shape than I'd thought. It was the shape of two people who'd been managed and alone in the same house, not the shape of two people who were incompatible." She let out a breath. "That's a different problem. A harder one in some ways, but different. Solvable," he said. "We're solving it," she said. "Right now. That's what this is." He looked at her, the gray eyes, the deliberate face, the man who had spent his entire life behind walls he'd built himself, standing on a cold beach in Maine with his hand in hers. No security detail, no operations director, no empire, just himself. She thought about how much had been stripped away and how the thing underneath, the actual thing, the person underneath the architecture, was more interesting than the architecture had ever been. She thought about the gala, the 12 minutes with Richard Blackwell that had set everything in motion. She thought about how Blackwell had read her correctly, had understood she was starved for genuine attention, genuine conversation, genuine presence, and had used that reading to build a weapon. But the thing he'd built the weapon out of was real. The hunger had been real. The recognition of it had been real. She was not starved for that anymore. "I don't need a ceremony," she said. "I don't need another contract or another event or anything official. I just needed you to know. This is a choice. I'm making it." She looked at him directly. "I choose this. I choose you. Not the arrangement, not the alliance. You." He looked at her for a long moment. The cold wind moved between them, and neither of them addressed it. "You're the first person," he said slowly, "who has ever chosen me when there was nothing to gain from it." She thought about that. "There's something to gain," she said. "It's just not money or territory." "What is it?" She looked at the water. "I'll tell you in about 10 years, when I have a better answer." She heard it, the sound he made that was not quite a laugh, the near laugh, the reflex that didn't get much use and was getting more use lately, and still sounded slightly surprised by itself each time. She held on to it the way she'd held on to the 2 seconds of his hands on her face in the dark. He kept holding her hand. She kept holding his. The water did what water does, indifferent, perpetual, going nowhere and going somewhere at the same time. And the light was brilliant and clean, and the cold was real, and neither of them moved to go back. They stayed there for a while. Not performing, staying, just staying. She called her father that evening from the kitchen of the rental house while Vincent made dinner. He'd been learning to cook badly with the same methodical stubbornness he applied to the water heater, consulting the recipe 3 times per step and refusing to approximate. She could hear the specific sound of someone reading a recipe very carefully and chose not to comment. Her father answered on the second ring. "Claire." His voice, Sunday call familiar, still carrying something careful in it that hadn't been there before October. "I just wanted to tell you we're good," she said. "Vincent and I. We're—" She looked at the kitchen, at the man badly making pasta with the same focus he'd once applied to running a criminal empire, and felt something move in her chest that she'd stopped trying to name because it was bigger than any single name. "We're good." A pause. She heard her father breathe. "I'm glad," he said, and it came out rough and real. "I'm so glad, sweetheart." She leaned against the doorframe and watched Vincent reread the recipe for the 3rd time on this step alone, and felt the specific quality of a life that had been broken down to its components and rebuilt with better information. Not fixed. She wasn't that sentimental about it. Not perfect. Nothing about any of it was perfect, including her father's voice on the phone with its carried weight, including the man in the kitchen who would never be easy and wasn't trying to be anything other than what he was, including herself, standing in a rental house in Maine, having made it through something that had no clean name. But real. Finally, comprehensively real. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah." "Sunday?" "I'll call Sunday." She heard him exhale, long, relieved, the sound of a man who hadn't known until this moment whether Sunday calls were still a thing. "Sunday?" he said. "I'll be here." She ended the call and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Vincent swear quietly at the pasta water for boiling over, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not the version in the story, the actual version. She went to turn down the burner before he noticed it himself. He looked at her when she reached past him. "I had it," he said. "I know you did," she said, and left her hand on the stove handle for a moment beside his, and he didn't move his hand, and the kitchen smelled like garlic and imperfect pasta and the cold salt air coming in under the back door. Outside, the harbor was dark now, and the lights of the town were doing their small, ordinary work against it, and the water was going where water goes, and none of it required anything from either of them except to stay.